In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Welcome at Pakhuis de Zwijger. My name is Servos and this is Science for the City, a program produced in collaboration with the AMS Institute. Today we're going to talk about the social distancing on sidewalks. The AMS Institute, in collaboration with the Technical University of Delft, produced a social distance dashboard, which produces a map where you can look at all places in the city, whether or not you can observe the social distancing. If you're joining us via Zoom, you can join the conversation. Please use the Q&A and please do tell us who the question is for, so we can ask the question to one of our guests. We are joined by a lovely group of people, together with guests from all over the world. We will talk about how these kind of tools can help us design the public space in Corona times and perhaps post-Corona times. With live in the studio, Arjan van Timmeren, and he is Scientific Director at the AMS Institute, with Ruben Olivehare, he is Designer of Public Space for the City of Amsterdam, and via Zoom, Achilles Psilidis, and he is Assistant Professor of the Technical University of Delft and Research Fellow at the AMS Institute. And we're also joined by Mike Linden, planner, writer and advocate of livable cities, that should we all strive for, and Cécile Maisonneuve, and she's chairperson at La Fabrique de la Cité in Paris, and that is an urban think tank. I want to welcome all the speakers for tonight. Thank you, and thank you for joining us. We start with Arjan van Timmeren. You're my co-host for tonight. Thank you for joining.
It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Can you explain what the AMS Institute is for those who are not familiar with AMS?
Yes, for sure. It's my pleasure to be here jointly with Pakhuis de Zwijger. AMS Institute is a knowledge institute which is originated by 3 universities. The University of Delft, which is also central in this broadcast, Wageningen University and MIT in Boston. And the 3 universities together with the City of Amsterdam and many societal partners, private but also citizens, we try to get a deep understanding of the city. And with this deep understanding, we try to help the city and citizens to solve the challenges of the future, of the challenges of today. And especially, of course, today's topic is about actual challenges we have as a result of the COVID crisis worldwide, but also in particular in Amsterdam.
And how can science be used to improve these kinds of topics?
Well, science, of course, has, on the first hand, we have a certain distance from topics, which makes it a more objective view. We tend to look to a larger time span, which is so a long-term perspective. And also, we tend to let's say, to validate whatever we find out. And this validation is through in practice, but also by theory and by other cases. And this validation is crucial to make, let's say, to help inform decision makers, to help inform designers, to help inform citizens in their decisions. It can be decisions how to design, how to form a city, but it can also be how to use a city.
And is there something we learned from previous crises, or is this so unique?
I think, well, there's a lot to say about crisis and the importance of crisis. Of course, it's not a very positive crisis we are going through as a world at the moment. But in resilience engineering, it's known that crises at times are necessary to increase resilience of a system. And I wouldn't say that I would like to demand a crisis every now and then, but it is often said, even an ancient prayer of the Dutch water boards, it says in the prayer, every now and then a little crisis will help us become more resilient. And of course, we don't want crisis, but it helps actually. It helps adapt society, people, institutions to, let's say, to disruptions and becoming more resilient.
So without the, 1952 water disaster in the Netherlands and the UK, we wouldn't have the Delta works.
Yes, that's a good example, but it's also at smaller scales, of course. But it's yeah, it is something which is not something you aim for, but we know that systems should be tested, and it holds for banking systems, but it also holds for public life to some extent.
And how would you hope science or your institution can contribute to spatial planning in the future with this kind of knowledge?
Well, what we tend to do with the AMS Institute here in Amsterdam, but also around the globe, is to introduce new opportunities based on technology. Often, but not as a goal itself, the technology, but as a let's say as a tool, as to use, let's say, to inform decision makers, like I said before, or users. And what we try to do is actually to help make a bigger step, a bigger leapfrog, so to say, in coping with all these challenges which are happening at the moment to us, let's say, as a society, but in particular to urbanized world and urbanized societies. And it has to do with urbanization, with climate change, with it can be related to mobility issues or with air quality. But all these challenges, they all together, they need let's say, an informed way to know how to act in the best way and to achieve impact.
And so, as an AMS Institute, you're working on all these topics and all these kinds of issues, not just the dashboard and the map you've produced today.
Yes, yes. And so we have a widespread of these challenges. We have actually 6 main themes. I will not name them all, but in all these themes, a very important issue is the use of new technologies, of data, of sensing. And today we will see that this is something which is really adding value to society and to decision makers.
It's quite nice, and thank you for being here. We go to the map itself. And we have Achilles Psilidis, and you're together with your research team, you designed the social distancing map. I have to say, I'm quite a map nerd myself, so I was quite happy that I was able to talk to you. What is the social distancing map? What does it show?
Well, thanks, Sarah, first of all, for having me. The social distancing map starts from a very simple idea. We're all familiarized with a new term which has entered our lives in the past few weeks, and that's the 1.5 meter society. So it starts from that point. And the challenge is there is like, since that rule has a spatial footprint, is for us to discover what kind of effect does it have, what kind of impact does it have on our cities, and how possible or not is it to comply with that rule. So that's a basic thing of the social distancing dashboard that applies.
And how did you and who came up with the map and how?
Well, together with my team, we started with this idea. We stepped up with a challenge on exploring whether or not it's possible to comply with the rule of the 1.5 meter distance. And then with the use of different data and different techniques, which I can explain shortly, we came up with the interactive maps that are presented in the dashboard.
You've prepared a few slides, which you're going to show us right now. So please go ahead and tell them more about it. Afterwards, we can discuss further.
So yeah, so if we can move to the next one. So indeed, for us, like you see that the social distancing challenge is a thing, and one of the factors that play a big role is, of course, the geometry of the spaces. And the widths of the sidewalks themselves, they pose a lot of challenges there, because if we see in the next slide, it's not only the sidewalk itself, but then we have several obstacles there that could hinder the possibility of the people to comply with that rule, with the 1.5 meter distance. And this could range from parked cars, from bikes, trees, lampposts, parking poles, you name it, and also bus stops, things that we also take into account in the dashboard. And all these things we wanted to take into account. And if we move to the next slide, our idea was that we measure the sidewalks and we classify them in such a way that we wanted to explore whether two people walking in the same direction or in opposite directions, they could keep a safe distance based on the social distancing rule, which applies in every country, and in the Netherlands it's the 1.5 meter distance rule. And therefore, based on this, we created a classification of all the sidewalks of different cities in the Netherlands for now, and we wanted to do that in as much automated way as possible. So if you move to the next slide, the way to do that is that we took advantage of many publicly available data sources, and these range from the topographic registries to the Central Bureau of Statistics and data from OpenStreetMap, and all of them in combination allowed us to perform the first steps of the dashboard, which I can show you in the next slide. And the next one, yes, thank you. So from the distance from the polygons, and we calculated the center lines, and based on that, we started classifying the widths of the sidewalks. And if you move to the next slide, yes, and the next, then we created a sort of categorization of the different footpaths in the city on whether it's difficult or very easy to comply with that rule. And we move on to the next one. Then that's one of the latest advancements, that we also now take into account the actual shape of the footpath into account. And you see that now it's even more clear. It's even clearer on how we see the geometry of the city and whether or not it's possible. And these are all color-coded, with blue being the one that's very easy, to red that it's quite difficult to comply with that rule. And the next slide. Of course, we needed to take into account some of the obstacles that I mentioned, and one of the biggest ones is like bus stops that take up space from the sidewalk itself. So it might be that you're walking on an ideal sidewalk, but on that specific spot where you also have people standing, it might be quite difficult to comply with that rule because the remaining space from the sidewalk becomes much narrower. So in the next slide, and with this one, we also calculated, aerial statistics. So to see the average values and to see in every neighborhood how much every neighborhood performs on average based on whether it's difficult or easy or ideal in complying with the rule. And in the next slide, I can show you just a couple of examples from Amsterdam. That's from the city center of Amsterdam, and specifically Kerkstraat in the Van Loonbuurt. And you see that example now with our latest advancement that we have. We take into account also different obstacles that are there. And as you see from the circle that I pointed out, that we take into account, you see like there are public toilets, there are like trash bins or collection for the trash. And then you see also how this translates into, that's from the streets level imagery. And if we move to the next one, that's a totally different example here. And that's from Belmermeer. And that's a Kloekvoortstraat. And you see there that the blue sidewalk that also takes into account the parking spaces. Of course, one of the things that we cannot take into account is the fact that I see here from the street view that somebody has not parked the car in an ideal way and has crossed over the sidewalk. But these are the things that somebody can now be aware of and navigate through the city based on these geometries. Now we can move to the next slide. We've done that for 7 cities as of now, and we're open to expand the dashboards for many different cities, both in the Netherlands and abroad. And of course, in the next slide, we're a team of people that do that. I'm leading, we're 7 people in total that we're working on this. And we're now developing our next steps, which include adding new functions that attract a lot of people, and also adding crowdedness measures, because it's not only the geometry that plays a role in that, and the 1.5 meter study, there are many, many factors, and we plan to include those in the next steps of our system.
Wow, quite impressive. Thank you for explaining this to us. So it's fully optimized, so if Paris or New York, to name a few examples, would call in, they would be able to get the map of their own quite quickly. Is that correct?
Yes, but we are also dependent on the availability of open data. So if there are like places where we don't have that much availability of open data sets, then, I mean, we're quite dependent on that. But the rest of the algorithms were very much automated, and we can apply it in every city worldwide.
Yeah, that would have been my next question, because the Netherlands is quite famous, or at least in the Netherlands, for keeping track of data. Not everywhere is there. There's that many data available. How do you do that when it's not there? Is it fully impossible, or are there other ways around that?
Well, we can search for different sources of data when other sources are not available. I mean, that depends also on the setting, and it's also one other thing that we need to take into account is that the 1.5 meter society is a Dutch reality, let's say. In other countries, it might be 1 meter or 2 meters. So we also need to take this into account when we classify our sidewalks, and we create the different classification. Yeah.
We are joined by Ruben Aluvehare. You are a urban planner at the City of Amsterdam. I'm not sure if people can... Yeah, here you are. So you just joined us on the table. We'll come to you in a few minutes, but and if you have a question, of course, please do ask. Arjan.
Yes, well, I think it's what's very important to mention here is that this tool which Achilles was telling about, which is an excellent tool in development, in continuous development, is based on social glass, which was before a tool we actually developed, the team of Achilles developed for events, for crowded events and for crowd control. At let's say normal life, this was, let's say, these were our challenges.
So social glass was a tool that you developed beforehand?
Yes, actually, and of course it's another tool, but based on that tool, actually, it's the reverse now. So what was first meant to be for a crowded place and how to deal with crowds, now it's being adapted, you could say, to, let's say, taking distance. I'm not sure if social distancing is the right framing. I would say socializing at a distance. So it's not that you don't socialize, of course. That's not what the tool intends to do. But it helps you to let's say, to take this social distance. And what it shows actually is that with the same data, or with database and some additions, you can actually use it in different ways. And now we are confronted with this COVID crisis, and I hope we are out of it soon. I think the City of Amsterdam is also heading towards strategies to do so. But of course, and then it will be back to crowd control perhaps, or another challenge. And I think that's important, that these automated ways of dealing will not be the only answer. It will always be, let's say, a hybrid answer we need by design and by physical solutions. And use-based solutions, but automated solutions can help in a very fast way in these kinds of disruptive events.
And Achilles, how did what kind of data? How did the data help you to identify bottlenecks? Of course, you saw the map of the city center, and it's mostly red. But did you find new information?
Well, it depends on the neighborhood. Well, it's not fully a surprise when we're talking about medieval cities that were developed like in the past that this rule would be difficult to comply with. But sometimes maybe the surprising thing is that in more modernized parts of cities, we see that there it could also be quite difficult to comply with that rule. And that's quite interesting to see also in perspective of putting different layers of the urban environment together. And see that, for instance, that it might be quite difficult to comply with that rule. So, yeah, that would be, I guess, interesting also for the people who are charged with designing the new policies and interventions of that. So we wanted to make them more aware.
Because you showed us two neighborhoods, like in detail with photos. One is in the city center of Amsterdam, the other one is in Bijlmer, which is a neighborhood in Amsterdam built in the 1960s, 70s, I think. But even there, it is not easy to comply with these kind of rules.
Well, there were indeed some places where it wasn't easy, but there we see that, for instance, in the example that I showed, that it was mostly possible because the sidewalks were wider. But it doesn't mean that modernized parts are easy as well to comply with that rule. And I think that that's interesting to see that also it's not only the medieval centers, which is quite expected, but also the more modernized part is to some extent.
So Achilles, just another question would be, we are going to switch in a while to one of the lead designers in Amsterdam, which is a special skill and a very skilled designer of green space. Speaking of green space, how do you label green space in this debate of public space? Is any green spot something you can just step upon? Huh? Can you use it, or can you destroy it perhaps if you do it too often? How did you deal with it in the tool?
Well, in the tool, there are different things. First of all, in terms of green or greenery, in the latest version where we have the polygons, we take into account where the tree trunks take space from the sidewalk. But we also have like areas like parks, etc. I didn't show that like on the map, but they're there as well. And there we also see whether it's possible through the different footpaths of the city, of the parks, to move along. But we also have like pedestrian areas where we have like a lot of greenery, where it's pretty easy and they were already designed for this. So therefore, yeah, in this regard, it would be quite easier for the people to comply with that rule.
Yeah. And could it become an interactive tool? I mean, this tool has been presented a couple of weeks ago in the media. It had a great representation in the newspapers, and something we saw as an institute immediately was a kind of feedback by let's say citizens who really try to test their own environment, their living environment, and say, hey, but there's something missing, or there's something which would it be an option to include as well, to have an interactive component which can be updated every now and then?
Yes, absolutely. That's something that we're already discussing with the municipality of Amsterdam, specifically to add also updates that might not be available in the data that we have, but we can add them to the system. That could also be extended to the citizens. We also plan to add perhaps like also a routing possibility or functionality where instead of going from A to B in the most efficient way, it would be from A to B in the most safe in terms of social distancing terms way.
Yeah.
Achilles, thank you so much for joining us today. Perhaps we talk to you at the end of the evening tonight. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
As just mentioned, Ruan, you joined us. You are a planner of urban spaces, a designer of urban spaces, and you initiate shared spaces here in Amsterdam. What are shared spaces? And it sounds quite non-social distancing.
It's non-social distance, certainly. Shared spaces is actually a philosophy developed by a Frisian traffic designer who passed away some years ago, quite young. And his simple theory was actually we've created too many rules, making spaces feel safer than they really are. And we should go back to communicating with each other. So he designed situations in Friesland, which is of course not that busy compared
to provinces in the north of the country.
Yes, but still he designed spaces in Friesland where people were forced to have eye contact before you act in the public space in terms of traffic. So cars, bicycles, pedestrians. So the term was shared space because you actually had a ruleless space where people communicating with each other could move around safely.
And so here in Amsterdam, there's a shared space just behind Central Station. And there is, for people who know Amsterdam, there is this biking path and bikers in Amsterdam bike quite fast. So they go through it. And then there is the ferries from Amsterdam North. So they have to go from the ferry to another biking path. And then there are all the pedestrians walking between that. That is the sharing space, but it's also kind of scary, or isn't that the point?
Well, people were scared of it before we actually made it. There were a lot of people really who didn't want this to be made because they thought there were going to be a lot of people dead there. And because living without rules is something very scary. But eventually we managed to get it through as a pilot, and we monitored it for 6 months, and there were a couple of little accidents, but nothing heavy. And I think that's particularly a space where we just kept on designing within the rules, but we didn't come out with the rules. So we decided, okay, let's just make this 30 by 30 meter space without rules that people really have to think and communicate with each other, and it worked.
How do you look at this map?
I think it's a great map because, first of all, right, I have to quote our king, His Majesty, because he said, let's make something that's not normal normal. He meant something else, fascism. But, but I think it's the same applies to, of course, social distancing. Arjan actually said it as well. Humans are not made for distancing. Humans are made to be social. So let's hope that this is temporary. But I think data in general, data has just taken such a massive flight in the last 10 years. It's amazing what you can do with data and how sure you can be of yourself. Because previously we used to just guess and hope and pray and do things. But now you can actually make an educated guess because there's such a lot of data.
And did the map change your outlook of the city?
No, because I know this. I think the map is actually. Look, I designed here for 35 years, so I know almost every single stone in the city. I know the sizes. If you ask me the size of a street, I'd know it. I know how busy it is, so I know the city. It's like the back of my hand. But of course, there's a lot of people. Think of tourists, simple, who just come here to explore a city. So when you come here to explore, you're definitely doing something that you don't know what you're going to come across. And a map like this can be fantastic in this period. For the next 2 years, I'm sure it'll take some time before we manage to get rid of this. I think it's such a handy tool. It's like, I mean, to make it simple, it's like driving a car and having Google Maps with the red lines. You know, we'll not take that road, we'll take the other road.
Yeah. And it's interesting to know, because the city is, of course, now moving, and as many cities in at least Europe and before Asia, we are moving from a crisis organization into a recovery organization, which is a next phase into this, well, some say a return to a new normal. And you just said, well, actually, to us, it would be perhaps the existing normal. Is it right? Or
no, I think it's a new normal, certainly, but and you could even say it might be COVID accelerated. Mm-hmm. But what's been happening in Amsterdam in the last 5 years is a sort of a mobility revolution, especially done by cyclists.
Yes.
The city itself was bowled over by the success of the cycle in the city. We, of course, did some policies to improve it, but that it doubled in 15 years, we couldn't have calculated it. So we've been busy with this mobility shift already for 5 years, doing it quite softly. Yeah. The Safatistraat, the Fietsstraat, which is also sort of shared space. Yes, and what this crisis is probably teaching us is we have to accelerate in this shift. Make more space for pedestrians, make more flexible public space, because we've been ruling the public space, 50 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers, everything divided by lines.
By lines and rules.
Lines and rules, and I think that creating flexibility will make us more robust in the future as well. So I'm not saying that everything should be shared space, but I think we have to rethink our rules, and I think this crisis will, as you said, it might be a stimulus to accelerate. I mean, look at the Belgians. It took them 3 weeks to turn a temporary city centre into temporary shared space, and they were very quick about it.
So perhaps we were a bit too much ahead, that we responded slower than some cities like Brussels. Huh?
Yes, I agree with you. I think we are a bit slower than the other cities that had a...
But now we are in this recovery and actually a phase, in a recovery to a form of a new way of dealing with public space, and we need to prioritize between sanitary, health-related characteristics and perspectives, social perspectives, people who want perhaps to drink together a beer on a terrace. But also spatial, economical aspects. And how do you prioritize as a designer? What would you say?
Arjan, that's a question that you could even ask our Prime Minister. But I think that's really difficult, because it's very difficult to be. Our public space has a maximum measurement. We won't be breaking down buildings to make more public space. So we have to always deal within. And we've always changed. Public space changes when we prioritize different aspects of the mobility in the public space. That's classical for hundreds of years. And what you could see is that, for instance, older people, there are more older people. they're more vocal. They want more mobility in the city, free mobility. So it's been forcing us to rethink this sort of thing anyway.
Yeah.
But to actually make an absolute statement about it is a little bit scary.
Yeah, it is. It is a very customized answer you need to find in every case. I
Maybe
suppose.
flexibility is the most important
Yes.
thing.
But Ruben, there are many projects going on the last few years, especially last years here in Amsterdam, to really push out the cars.
Yeah.
In Dutch it's called autoluw.
Yeah.
Hard to translate in something, a project to reduce the amount of cars. It's about 12,000 parking spots less, isn't it?
I think the political agreement was 25,000.
Oh, 25,000. Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
In the coming year.
Yeah.
So a lot less cars anyways. How many parking spots are there in the city?
225,000. So it's about 10%.
Okay, and but did this project accelerate because of the corona response, or is this something completely different?
Well, if you look at our menu card, which has been published, keep it on, without going into details, it really means that we have to create more space on the pavement. In order to do that, maybe we have to push all the parking, all sorts of other things, and the cyclists onto the road. We will be doing that as a temporary measure, but there'll be a lot of places that it could take a permanent character. Even if you do it temporarily, it's just like having these pilots, Safatistraat. We had to do it because people were scared about it, but it turned out to be okay.
Safatistraat is the combination of where
Cyclists with
bike
cars.
is
Yes.
the main mode of transportation. On the street is cyclists,
Yes.
and cars are the guest.
Cars are the guest.
Yeah.
They have to ride behind the cyclists.
Yeah.
So if you're actually making a lot of public space in Amsterdam just for the next 2 years, temporarily shifting people from the pavement to the street, combining cars and cyclists, for instance.
People might like it.
People might actually like it because people liked it on the Safatistraat as well. And if there are no accidents or very little accidents or the same amount of accidents as normal, a lot of people would say, let's keep it like this.
Yes.
We have a question from the audience for you, Arjan. Tom from MIT Sensible Lab. Yeah. Is there a potential to use these results to be merged with transportation data to suggest streets that could be temporary just for pedestrians? It's basically going on this same route.
Well, I think so. I suppose this would be an option, and you could actually we could also involve Achilles to ask so. But I think this is indeed something you would like to be more, let's say, lean and to respond to dynamics of every day almost. Of course, it will not be as lean in the beginning, but I think, like Ruan was telling, flexibility will be the main rule because we have a shortage of space, and in that case, you would like to anticipate as much as you can to changing conditions.
Achilles, could you answer that really quickly? Respond to that?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. Because as I said, geometry is only one factor. Other factors can be added as well. Crowdedness, and if that is also traffic, could play a role, but it's mostly about, how the society, the people like pedestrians, cyclists, these are the foremost important, right? And the people who also stay at places, like waiting for the line, waiting for the bus. So the cars is a lower priority for now. And
Ruan, what are the most appealing innovations that your team is working on right now to round up this part of the discussion?
Well, it's coincidentally a project that we work together on. It's the first or second part of Haberstad, a big project in the city. And I mean it really. I really want the municipality to make the most sustainable, greenest, most mobility shift, urban new environment in the whole world. That's the ambition.
Yeah.
Well, we had a couple of really nice workshops about it, looking at all the modern themes. Arya mentioned them in the beginning, in the introduction, about climate change and things like that. And we are making completely new types of streets. Nobody's ever seen them before. They're greener, they have more water in it, the cyclist in the middle of the road, there's no parking in it, all the parking is inside the building blocks.
So greener, more water, more.
Yes.
That sounds like a busy street. Could you describe a picture of the street?
Yes. Well, normally, say 20 years ago, if I had a 20-meter street, which is more or less the general size of streets in Havenstad, we would design it from the middle to the outside, saying, okay, there's a 8-meter street. It's tarmac or something else. Then you have cycles. Then you have the sidewalks. And what's left over for the pedestrian is the sidewalk. In Havenstad, we've done it the other way around, gone from outside to inside, saying as many as possible one-way streets. So we only have 4.5-meter streets, which allows a little bit of flexibility so that if somebody's bringing a packet, you can actually park on the street and people can pass you. And the rest is all for playing, green, pedestrians, everything. And in the middle of the street, you've got this smooth bit, so the cycle will always be forced to go into the middle because it's the most comfortable bit. So it's a different philosophy.
Yeah, and it's also including, of course, not just the surface area, but also the surfacing area below. Huh?
Yes.
So with climate change-related adaptiveness of taking up of water and all kinds of functions meant to deal with changing conditions.
I think that would be a great topic for a future discussion. But we have something really nice. We have via Zoom both Mike Leiden and Cécile Maisonneuve via Zoom. Cécile, we come to you in a few minutes, but first we go to Mike. Mike, you are in New York, is that correct?
That is correct. And
how is life there with you? Are you safe?
We are safe. It seems like a new challenge every week in the city, but our family is safe and we're doing well. Thank you.
Happy to hear that. You are an internationally recognized planner, writer and advocate for livable cities. And in 2017, you were named by Planetizen as one of the 100 most influential urbanists. That is what my colleague wanted me to read. It sounds quite impressive. Could you tell a bit about it? What is a writer advocate for livable cities? How do you become something like that?
Well, I'm a co-founder of an urban planning and design firm, but part of our ethos is research and providing best practices and mostly open source for people to utilize around the globe, around public space, and how to transform streets, parks, plazas, squares, neighborhoods, et cetera. So one of the things that our firm is very well known for, we do a lot of work with, is what we call tactical urbanism. So it's a methodology for delivering projects that starts with low cost and very, very flexible materials to try to convince people and test ideas and see what works and what doesn't, and learn and do all that before you invest millions of dollars or euros in long-term infrastructure. So we've done a lot of writing about that with books and guides and resources. And most recently, we just co-authored a new guide that just came out with a North American organization called NACDO, which is comprised of city transportation officials, and then with the Global Designing Cities Initiative that is related to NACDO to provide guidance on street design around the world. And our new guide focuses on the response and recovery to COVID, and so what you can do in the public realm, both streets and public spaces. So that just came out a few weeks ago. We have more guidance coming out in the next couple of weeks on that topic as well.
Wow, you've been collecting over 60 examples from all over the world. What kind of cities do we have to think about?
We have more than 300 now.
Oh, wow.
It's pretty remarkable. So back in March, as shutdown was starting to happen both here in the States and around the globe, we started to see a quick pattern emerge, which was that cities were going to remake the public space, at least temporarily, to allow for physical distancing. And then, part of that was mobility. Part of that was just to have space to move in the few parks or public spaces that remained open, that were threatened to be crowded by people who need to get out of their apartments. So anyway, we started to document this, and there's been a very clear typology of interventions that has emerged one of which is the widening of pavements for pedestrian movement. So that's why it was really interesting to see Achilles' map and the data collection that's happening there. But a range of other interventions are happening as well. And most recently, we're seeing streets being transformed for dining and retail as the cities in the US and abroad start to open up again to allow for cafes and restaurants and shopping. So all this is really shifting from week to week. And of course, here in the US and now increasingly abroad, we have protests that are taking over streets. And so this notion of what a street is for is really expansive right now. And how we use our streets is really important as we communicate the need to overcome social unrest in our country anyways, and of course globally.
Mike, happy to be here in discussion with you and happy to hear about these findings. What I also would like to talk with you about is this open streets pilot you did in the de Blasio administration, and it's interesting because I think it failed shortly after introduction because of de Blasio wanted the police to act upon to setting rules. So it connects really to what we just discussed about. City open streets need actually ways to do so. This shared space without rules, as less as possible. Is it right? Could you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah. So, and to be clear, this is an initiative of the city, not of our work. Although we're big fans and proponents of the approach generally, but in New York, the city really fumbled the first version of open streets. It was 4 very short segments in what seemed like random parts of the city, and they were very, very, very over-policed. So there was usually 2 to 4 officers at every intersection, which is not a welcoming environment. And socially, people didn't want to go there to recreate or to be outside. And of course, this was also when it was still relatively cold outside. Since then, the city changed tack. There was a lot of advocacy against doing it with less police presence. And now the city is committed to doing 100 miles, so about 160 kilometers of open streets. And at this current moment, we have about 35 miles open around the city. And it's all using very, very lightweight infrastructure. It's usually just what we call a French barricade, just a metal little gate that you move from the sidewalk into the street at 8 a.m. in the morning, and then you put it back on the sidewalk at 8 p.m. at night. And some of the stretches are quite short, but some of them are getting longer and longer. Yeah. And so the way that the barricade works is like a $100 cost, and it breaks people's understanding of what the street is for. It just allows people to see it differently, and then now people are taking to the public space and sharing it. Yeah, that's great.
And is it, where can we find your findings? Is there any way we could look at your project right now? Do you have a website or blog?
It's a Google Sheet, and I could send the link to you to review. I'm not sure if I can put that in the chat.
I'm pretty sure it's on the website, but otherwise we'll put it on the website. Yes. We'll come back to you in a few minutes because we have to go to Cécile Maisonneuve. You're chairperson of La Fabrique de la Cité. What is La Fabrique de la Cité?
La Fabrique de la Cité is a think tank which is dedicated to urban innovation and perspective. We're based in Paris, but we work with many partners around the world, including the AMS in Amsterdam. And the idea of La Fabrique de la Cité is to bring around the table all the experts of cities, but from very different backgrounds. The idea is that to put together people coming from official government, coming from research, coming from NGOs and the social sciences, fundamental sciences, all together to build projects on mobility and public spaces and all the topics we are talking today.
And you're working, because of course, also in Paris, there's a social lockdown. Where are you working right now? Are you allowed to go to the office?
We are allowed to, but not at all encouraged to do so. We are the main effect of the crisis in Paris is total crisis in public transportation. And as you know, the subway in Paris is very efficient when it works, and when it doesn't work, and currently we are discouraged to do and to use it, it's very difficult for the city to move. So most of us are still working from home when it's possible, of course. And another reason for this is that schools are not really reopened, and in the Paris region, as opposed to the rest of France, we are still under a stricter regime, stricter rules, because the virus is still more active than the rest of the countries. So most of the kids in the Paris area are not at school. So for parents, they also have to stay at home for this reason.
Cecile, knowing Paris quite well, I know that the sidewalks in Paris are quite wider in general, I would say, than in Amsterdam. Of course, densities are also much higher, I think amongst the highest in Europe, actually, in the city centre. How would you say, how is the city of Paris dealing with this different use of sidewalks? For instance, we know that up till 2 days ago, restaurants were not allowed to be open or to use terraces, but I saw some nice footage that people actually were having dinner all over the public spaces. Can you tell a bit about it?
Yes, so as you rightly reminded, Paris density is one of the highest in the world, with 21,000 people per square kilometer, so it's 6 times more than in Amsterdam. So, and when there was a map published of the sidewalks of Paris as well, which was published by the design agency Vraiment. And when you look at Paris, most of the streets and most of the sidewalks are in red, meaning that we are not meeting the right criteria for social distancing. So, but actually there are 2 Paris. Of course, the Haussmannian Paris has been designed for COVID. Haussmann even predicted COVID, and so this is not a problem on this part of the city. But in other areas, this is truly a problem. And I personally live in Le Marais, and as you can imagine, social distancing in this area is just impossible. So you saw this footage, and of course, Paris is now Paris again because of the reopening, not only of restaurant terraces, but also of the reopening of green spaces, because those were closed, have been closed for the whole lockdown, and it totally changed the atmosphere and the physiognomy of the city. But in this landscape, there is one person which is forgotten in my sense. It's a pedestrian, because the reopening of restaurants, so restaurants are not allowed to welcome customers within the restaurant itself, only on terraces, and they have been allowed to use more spaces on sidewalks and without having to pay for it. But in this respect, the pedestrian has to find his way now. He has to sneak between the tables of restaurants. So social distancing is perfectly respected for the customers of the restaurant, but for pedestrians, it's another story.
So Paris is one big bistro now.
It is, and it will be even better, even worse from the different point of view in the coming weeks. For this policy, I mean, is only one part of the policy on sidewalks. As you may have seen, there is still a real fierce ongoing battle about street space between cars and bikes. So this is for the moment the really fierce battle, as opposed to the restaurant and terraces one, which is which makes consensus. Nobody questions this. So it's very strange to see those places where everybody's meeting, while at the same time between cars and bikes the atmosphere is rather different. Another point I think is very important for the moment in Paris. It's the idea that public space could help retail and private business to survive, because the rent issue for private business is absolutely terrible, and for the moment they have no choice but receiving very limited number of customers. So I think it's interesting, because in the past years we could have said that public space was seen more from a business perspective, and it was challenged by financial considerations. And today it could be the savior of private business.
And
frankly speaking, I think this is an urgent topic. We see more and more, for example, bookshops in Paris, historical ones, announcing that they're going to close because they can't pay their rent anymore. And it's not Amazon's problem. Yeah. It's really the problem of the rents.
So you say the public space is actually the saving grace, you could say, our saving grace as a city.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. For restaurants, obviously, but in a wider sense, you were talking about the phase of recovery we're in now. I think we could do much more, and that we have to accelerate for those small retail shops to survive. Because what makes, as we all know, the quality of public space is not only public space itself, it's the relationship between this space and the ground floor of buildings. And if those ground floor are not the shop we know anymore, or replaced by shops you can see in every street, it's not the same atmosphere anymore. And from that point of view, I think that the crisis may also be an accelerator, in the meaning that even before the crisis, we saw more and more ground floor small shops which were replaced by short rental apartments for tourists. So if the crisis accelerates this movement, it would really change the atmosphere of public space in Paris. So from that point of view, I think we have to take very urgent actions.
And would you say that the crisis would have a positive effect then on urban planning? Or is it a bigger threat?
For the moment, I think it's difficult to answer you in Paris because I didn't mention it, but all those debates are taking place in a very specific context, not only the crisis, but we are in an election time. We will have the second round of municipal elections in Paris and in many other French cities at the end of this month. The first one took place just before the lockdown. So for the moment, I would say that debates around this extremely important topic you're mentioning are not very serene. We are in kind of a very political debate around, I mentioned it, about bikes and cars, and I wish we had this debate, but I think it will start only maybe in September. For the moment, the question is really to know if what has been done up to now will be, it was mentioned before, will be temporary or permanent. But in this time, in this election time, difficult to have the right debate about it.
Thank you so much, Cecile. Thank you also for Mark London. And I haven't mentioned your company yet. It's Principal of Streets Plans. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And Cécile Maisonneuve from La Fabrique de la Cité. Thank you so much for joining us. And one last question. Would you, are you applying for participating in this in the social distancing dashboard for your cities?
So would New York and Paris been helped by Achilles?
I think it would be very useful. I'm a pedestrian in Paris, mostly. So I would be very, very interested in getting these kind of tools, because we say that when we have to live with this virus, so we have to make our own decisions. And this is a tool for decision making.
And Mike, for you as well, quick question, because we're running out of time.
Yeah, we had another design team do something very similar in New York City several weeks ago, but I don't know how sophisticated the data depth was on it. I think for our city moving forward, the analysis is not just the walking space, but it's going to be the dining space. You know, what space is available and how many tables can we get into the street and on the sidewalk. So I think having that kind of a layer where you can see the output of number of tables would give more of the possibility for businesses. But in any event, it's a wonderful tool, and I hope people around the globe find use in it.
Thank you so much. We have to wrap up. We're almost at the end of the evening. What do you thought? The international examples, can we use that in Amsterdam, Rowan?
Well, what Cecile was saying was, of course, a real problem in Amsterdam too. There's a lot of discussion, political discussion going on about our ground floor spaces in the city center, how they've already changed, and maybe this crisis will change them quicker. You know, if people start get used to buying almost everything on four wheels rather than going to the shop, it might change the whole character of public space for a long time. And that's something that we really have to work together to see where is it going, what can we do about it, because I think cities that have uninteresting public spaces for locals aren't proper cities.
Yeah. Yes, I would say that the public space in general, all over the world, in all cities, in all areas, but in particular in European cities with history, is so precious. It's something so to care for that we should never see it alone. We should always take it together with the nearby uses, be it terraces, be it commercial use, or be it houses. The streets must have eyes, is a famous claim. And so I think for public space, it's also important that it relates to what happens next to it, be it in a park, be it in a canal, be it in the houses or the buildings. So here the Paris example, as others, is very crucial and useful for Amsterdam as well. There is a momentum to take action, I would say. Yes.
Looking forward to that, but and if you look at the city right now, you see that the more and more houses are on the renting market, so it's getting easier to rent a house. As you say, it is easier to try out new things to build a new kind of public space. Would you say we have to move to a post-corona situation? We should keep this, or how do you want to move forward?
Well, I agree entirely with what Arjan said, that you sometimes need a crisis to actually make you rethink and be quicker and more innovative. Because I'll tell you one thing, it's, when you have a city with a culture and a civil service culture, change is the most difficult thing to actually get together. Because change means risk. And there are very few people who want to take the risk. You know what I mean? Yeah. The journalist from the Parole rang me up. I was in England teaching when he rang me up and said, "Is it going to be safe, the shared space behind Central Station?" I said, "Of course." And I held my breath because I thought, imagine if something goes wrong, everybody who said, "You said it's going to be safe." So you have to take a risk to innovate, and I think something like a crisis can actually accelerate the innovations.
And one last question: why is we talked about Brussels, car city #1 in Europe? Well, not fully, but one of the. They're innovating so fastly now, and when I look at Amsterdam, the city did announce that the bikes would go from the bike path and go to the streets, but nothing happened. Why is that?
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest, but I think we were talking about it before we started the show, but it's maybe because sometimes when you're way ahead of others, it can actually work as a
slowing you down.
Slow you down.
Yeah.
You've had your traditions, it's been successful, so you think, well, let's not jump into conclusions and let's do it, softly. So that might be the case. Yes. There's a famous Dutch thing: if you're retarded, you can jump forward quicker. What do you call it? I don't know how you say it in English. There must be in English as well.
So if you're behind, you lag because you're behind the competition.
Yes.
We're at the end of the evening, unfortunately. I would love to talk much longer with you about this topic. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Arjan van Timmeren, of course, thank you for helping me ask all these questions. We are producing a lot of livecasts here from Pakhuis de Zwager. Also tonight, in about an hour time, we'll start with another livecast about the inequality in education in times of crisis. And of course, you can look at all the other programs we produce on our website, www.dezwager.nl. You can see it behind me on the screen. There is a tool to only select the English language programs. So there are a lot of interesting things to view. We are a non-profit organization. All our programming are free of charge. We like to keep it that way. If you think it would be nice to help us produce these kind of programs, after the program ends, you can see the QR code where you can give us some amount via the pay as you like button. as I said, also on the website and all the other places, there are a lot of other shows going on, so please have a look. And thank you all so much for joining us, also from all over the world. And see you at the next Science for the City. Thank you.
Thank you very much.